big part of what we're working on is trying to make sure that the upcoming November election gets carried out in a way that will allow everybody to participate and leads to an outcome that everybody can see is as a legitimate one, one they can believe in. Even before the pandemic came along, there were already lots of concerns about potential problems with the November election, as I'm sure you know. And there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, we are a very closely divided country with a great deal of polarization. So the election's likely to be a close one. And then we have the prospect of foreign interference in the election, which seems like a real one after the experience 4 years ago, up to the possibility that there may even be hacking of registration rolls, even hacking of voting machines, or maybe the grid will get shut down in a particular place. All of that is still a possibility, unfortunately. We have a president who has repeatedly made the claim that millions of fraudulent votes were cast in the last election. You put all of that together, and so there's good reason to think that at the end of the election night, beginning in November, we'll end up with a process of fighting over the election with claims that some people weren't prevented from voting, others voted illegally, that it's hard to figure out who really won, and it could a kind of fight that could go on for weeks and months with half the country never quite sure they believe the winner really won the election. You students are too young to remember that this happened once before in 2000, but some of us in the Bush v. Gore election remember that that can happen. And so we're trying to prepare for that. But on top of all that preparation, we now have the COVID-19 pandemic. And because of that, a lot of the preparation work is now shifted to the kinds of changes that need to be made so you can hold an election in November safely and with full participation. The democracy can't stop just because we're having a crisis, but it'll take a lot of work to make it actually work well in November. And so, first of all, let me talk about the election schedule. We need to anticipate and plan for the election in November to happen when it's scheduled to happen, which is on November 3rd. We've seen a lot of primary elections this last few weeks be delayed for a couple of months, and that's been actually a really good thing. Those primaries, pushing them back to June has allowed states to prepare for the massive increase in mail that you're going to see in voting this year, as people don't want to go to polling places. They'd rather send in absentee ballots. But you can't just have that kind of process ramped up instantly. If you don't plan for it and prepare for it, you end up with the kinds of problems we saw in Wisconsin 3 weeks ago, where they held a primary without any delay, and they just weren't ready. A great many people asked for absentee ballots because they didn't want to go to a polling place, and those absentee ballots never showed up in time for them to vote. So they were left with only one choice, which is to go to a polling place on election day. And unfortunately, the very few election workers really wanted to work in the polls that day because they were afraid to go to work. And so there were very few places you could go to vote. In the city of Milwaukee, which is a city of over 500,000 people, there were only 5 polling places open instead of a usual number of over 180. So we saw those long lines of voters 6 feet apart with masks on, waiting hours to try to vote in that Wisconsin primary. Fortunately, ultimately, it wasn't a very close election in any of the big races, and so it didn't dissolve into a big, huge squabble. But Wisconsin is a warning sign of what really needs to be done so we don't have a similar kind of election problem with COVID-19 in November. So, you know, the primaries will finish up in June. There'll be some kind of nominating conventions. We'll have presidential nominees in August. The conventions may be done by Zoom, I don't know. But then the election comes on November 3rd, and we elect not only the president, but the entire House of Representatives and a third of the Senate. And the key thing I think to know is you really can't move that election the way we've been moving these primaries. There are lots of deadlines that are set by law, indeed are set by the Constitution, that prevent the election from being moved more than a few days if there was some reason to do that. The Electoral College is actually what gets elected in November to vote for the president, which is a bunch of people who then meet in December to cast votes for president. And so time from the election process to the meeting of the Electoral College on December 14th, all of that has to sort of go in sequence. And then on January 3rd, the whole Congress disappears. Their terms of office are over. A third of the Senate and the entire House are out of office. We need a new Congress elected by then so they can be sworn in. And then the president's term of office ends on January 20th, regardless of whether we've had an election or not. So all of us need to plan to have the democracy work, to have the election happen, let people vote on November 3rd when the date that Congress has set for this all to happen. And to do that, what we need to do is to make sure that in every state, people can have a readily available way to vote by mail. People are not going to want to go to the polling place in all likelihood unless things get an awful lot better very quickly with respect to this pandemic. And so they need to be able to send in their ballots, and the states need to be in a position to get the ballots out, get them back, get them processed, because you know, when you go from 100,000 maybe absentee ballots in a big state to 5 million, you can't just do that without a lot of stress and strain. We also think that there still should be some polling places. Some people are going to want to vote in person, but the way to do that is to spread out the days when you can vote, not just one day, but maybe over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, so you don't get crowding at the polling places, and you can use each polling place more efficiently. But one thing that has to change is the laws in some states. There are a lot of states, a dozen or so at least, where in order to cast an absentee ballot, you have to give them a reason of why you can't vote in person. And a number of those states are saying, we don't consider the pandemic a reason. Your fear of contagion is not a good enough reason. And so lawsuits are springing up against these states saying you can't, in a time of pandemic, fail to make available absentee ballots and tell people they have to make a choice between not voting and risking exposure that they don't want to have in a polling place. A second kind of problem is there's a bunch of states where you can cast an absentee ballot, but you have to have a witness or 2 witnesses or even a notary sign your ballot, which means if you're sheltering in place alone, you simply can't vote. There's no way to do it. And so we saw that in Wisconsin. A number of people were told they had to have a witness of their ballot, but they were alone in their homes and didn't exactly know how to do that. Wisconsin also has a requirement that you get a photocopy of your driver's license and mail it in with your absentee ballot. If you're sitting at home, you don't exactly have access to a Xerox machine. And so these kinds of requirements are being scrutinized. Lawsuits are being filed in states that won't change their laws. I think we'll get to the point where the whole country, or nearly the whole country, people will really be able to vote by mail this year. And that process needs to happen if we're going to have a fair and legitimate election, I think. There's a bunch of other problems with the democracy that have been caused by the arrival of this pandemic. One of them is that in a number of states, Virginia unfortunately is not one of them, voters have the right to amend their state constitutions by getting enough signatures on a petition and then putting a measure on the ballot that would amend the Constitution if it passes with the voters. That's how a number of states, for example, have passed these anti-gerrymandering provisions, which take the job of drawing legislative districts away from the politicians and give it to independent, nonpartisan commissions. And there are a number of states in which citizens groups are trying to pass just that kind of measure in 2020. But the problem they've run into is just when the time for them to start collecting signatures on petitions was coming along, the pandemic hit. And the usual way that you get petitions signed for things like these ballot measures is you go to places where crowds gather, like county fairs and shopping malls, or maybe you go door to door, although that's less efficient. In any event, none of that is really practically possible right now. So the process of getting petitions signed in order to get these ballot measures on the ballot has been shut down. And so what we've done, and others are doing as well, is bringing lawsuits against the states that have these ballot measure petition requirements and saying, look, this year it's just not possible to require in-person signatures. You're going to have to let people use electronic signatures. You're going to have to give them more time and lower the number of signatures they need, or the entire process of having the people be able to amend their constitution will be shut down just because of the practical problem that nobody's able to go face to face and get people to sign these petitions. So that's the second kind of problem that's arising, and it's producing major lawsuits. A third thing that's happening now is people are looking at how the absentee ballot system works. You know, one of the questions is when a piece of paper comes into the state that says, I'm Joe Smith, I'm voting for President Trump for president, how does the state know that it was really Joe Smith who cast that ballot? It's not a fraudulent ballot. And the system that they use in most of the states is to look at the signature of the voter on that ballot and compare it to the signature that they have on file from that person. This is a pretty terrible way of verification, because signature matching is something that experts would tell you requires a great deal of training, requires a lot more than just two examples. But these states just have these amateur election officials do these comparisons. And ultimately, we don't think we can get rid of that system this year, even though there's going to be a massive increase of absentee voting. The systems are going to stay. But what we are trying to do, and there are lawsuits about this as well, is at least make sure that when a voter's vote is rejected based on the supposition that the signatures don't match, they get notice, they get told that they're a mismatch, that and an opportunity to come in and say, that really is my ballot, you should count my vote. You know, it's just that my signature has evolved over time, as people's signatures do. Or you know how sometimes these days you do a signature on like an electronic pad, which makes the signature look completely different than it would if you did it in pen and ink. And so you're going to see a lot of litigation about these signature match systems now that most people in this country, in all likelihood, are going to be voting by mail in November. So that's kind of a tour of the legal problems connecting the pandemic to the election. And we're just going to have to wait and see how America comes through all of that. But I wanted to also talk to you a little bit about the pandemic and the census. The so-called Decennial Census conducted by the Census Bureau is this thing that happens every 10 years when the United States government attempts to count every person in the country and register where they were living on April 1st of the census year, which is a year ending in 0. So this is a census year, 2020, and they're trying to figure out where everybody was living on April 1st and just have a count of the entire population of the country. And this process was just getting underway in March when the whole shutdown occurred. And that doesn't entirely prevent the census from going forward, because the way it's working this year for the first time is you get a letter from the government that says, go to census.gov and put in your information. And about half the population has done that. But the problem is, in every year, a lot of people don't either return the card in the old system or go online and do it in the new system. And so the government every 10 years has to hire an army of temporary employees to go out and knock on doors of households where they haven't gotten an answer and find out how many people were living there on April 1st and who they were and that sort of thing. And the problem, of course, is the army was hired, but they're not able to do their work out and knocking on people's front doors and asking them the census questions in the middle of the pandemic, at least not yet. There may come a time in the fall when they can do that, but at the moment they can't. And so all that we're left with are these commercials you may have seen on TV where they're asking everybody to fill out a census form. And by the way, if your family hasn't done it, you should. The information is entirely confidential. It does a lot of good for the local area, and it's for democracy. What does the census have to do with democracy? Well, the census is important for many reasons other than democracy, but one of the things that happens every 10 years in the year that ends in a 1, right after the census is completed, is all the district maps for all the members of Congress, for the state legislatures, all have to get redrawn. They have to get redrawn because the idea is that every district ought to have a number of people living in it. And enough people in this country move around in 10 years that you have to start over with a new map. You think about the kind of population growth we've seen in parts of Northern Virginia that would, in the last 10 years. There are districts that are vastly overpopulated that were drawn 10 years ago because of the population growth. Happily not in Rappahannock, but in not that far away parts of Prince William County and Loudoun County. So the redrawing of the districts needs to happen next year. Census, because of the problems they're having with the delay of the follow-up visits and getting enough data in, has said that they are not going to be able to produce the data needed to redraw the districts on time. The deadline for them to do that ordinarily is March of the year ending in a 1, next March. But they've announced and they've asked Congress that they're just not going to be ready until midsummer in 2020. A particular problem for Virginia, because Virginia, unlike almost every other state except New Jersey, has legislative elections in odd-numbered years, including 2021. There will be an election for the General Assembly, the House of Delegates, in 2021 in November. And if they don't get the data from the Census Bureau about how to start redrawing the districts for the House of Delegates until the middle of the summer in 2021, about whether they can do the remap, hold the primary elections, and then hold a general election all within 2-3 months. And there's a real serious possibility that we may end up using the old legislative districts that were drawn 10 years ago, even though they are grossly out of date with very disparities in them. And some would say they were very gerrymandered 10 years ago as well. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out in Virginia, but there's an awful lot of people scrambling around trying to figure out how to deal with a delay in the census that now seems almost inevitable because of the pandemic. So those are sort of pandemic-related democracy issues I wanted to talk about. There's another issue that I wanted to mention, because it's along with the stuff I've already been talking about. It's one of the things that keeps me up at night. And that is relating to how the presidential election will work in a different sense. As I mentioned, and as you already know, I'm sure, we operate our presidential elections in a very odd way. We don't have popular voting for president. We elect electors who then vote for the president in December. When you go to vote for the president, you're basically electing these electors. And one of the problems with the Electoral College, as you probably know, as you remember from 2016, is that it can produce a result that is different from the popular vote. Each state gets a certain number of electors corresponding to the number of members of Congress and the Senate the state has. And if it's a sort of winner take all for that state. If one candidate wins a lot of states narrowly, they can have a victory in the Electoral College and not in the popular vote, as President Trump did, in fact, in 2016. But I don't want to talk about that problem. There's an entirely different problem with the Electoral College, which is coming along potentially this year, and that relates to the assumption that everybody has always made that these electors are not really decision makers. They're simply automatic placeholders who cast whatever the vote is. If Virginia votes for Biden, then all the electors for Biden show up on the 14th, and they all vote for Biden automatically. There's no reason to think otherwise. But the Supreme Court of the United States is right now considering a case in which it's being argued that the process is not automatic, that the electors are free agents, even though they're elected on a slate for one candidate or the other, that they can go to the meeting of the Electoral College in December and vote for whoever they want to. That was the original understanding of the Electoral College at the time of the founding of the country, and that the states are not free to require electors to vote for the person who won their state. And the Supreme Court rules that way in June, what would that mean for the election? Well, it might mean a great deal. The problem may be that we have a very close election. Imagine if one of the two candidates beats the other by just 1 or 2 electoral votes. And we have a Supreme Court decision saying that these 535 people are free to vote for whoever they want to, regardless of how the election went. Suddenly, the names of these obscure people that we've never even known about will be in the news. There will be efforts to persuade them to change the outcome of the election. There may even be inducements, pressure, demonstrations. All kinds of stuff are possible because no one has ever anticipated these electors are important free agents who can decide the election themselves based on their own best judgment, which is obviously is an insane way to run the railroad, but there is serious possibility that the Supreme Court will say that's what the framers intended, so that's what we're going to have. So just add that to your list of things that could make the outcome of the November 3rd presidential election even crazier than all of the horrible parade of horrible stuff that I already talked about at the beginning, hacking, claims of fraud and the like. And so we are all gearing up for what may be the lawyer fest of all time. Ready, if we can get people able to vote by mail, so the verification of those ballots can be done, if we can get rid of these stupid witness requirements that are going to prevent people from voting and the like, hopefully we can have a smooth election. There's no reason why we have to have a disastrous election, but it's certainly a possibility and something that a lot of election lawyers, a lot of people involved in politics these days are very worried about and are trying to take steps to prevent. So I wonder if there are people out there who would be interested in asking questions. I have other things I could talk about, but maybe we have about 18 minutes left. Maybe we'll see if there are topics you would be interested in talking about. If you're familiar with Zoom, you can use the participants box and raise your hand. That might be one way to do it. Or use the chat. I see there's a chat thing going on here. Let's see what that says. Have there not been faithless electors in the past? The answer is there have been electors in the past who have not followed the state vote. Indeed, there were a number of them in 2016. That's 4 or 5. That's how these are people who were punished by their states for not voting for Hillary, essentially, in Washington State and Colorado. But there has never been an elector who didn't follow the popular vote that changed the outcome of the election. And so what the worry is, if the Supreme Court endorses this and says their pledges are, and they do pledge to vote for the winner in their state, if the Supreme Court says that pledge isn't worth anything, then it's just the honor system and you can do whatever you want and you can't be punished, that there will be more of them and that people may actually be willing to do it in a way that changes the outcome of the election, which would, I think, cause a legitimacy crisis of massive proportions. The American people have always assumed they get to decide who the president is. They're sometimes unhappy about the fact that the Electoral College changes it, but at least that's written into the Constitution that way. But this idea that we would have individuals whose names don't even appear on the ballot changing the outcome of the election is very scary, I think. Other questions, either by raising your hand or by the chat function, works very well as well. Not seeing any. Let's see, there's a chat, hold on. Are there typical characteristics of the states that are resisting or making absentee balloting difficult? I think it's fair to say that the places that are resisting voting by mail, saying that you have to have good reasons, are red states, typically. States, there has been a little bit of a politicizing of this issue of moving to vote by mail. The president made a few remarks about it in his many news conferences, suggesting that vote by mail is a way in which fraud gets into the system. The reality is there are 4 or 5 states where all votes have been cast by mail for the last couple of decades, and there's no suggestion that in Oregon or Colorado there's a lot of fraud. But I think there are people in a few states who are resisting this on the theory that there may be some political advantage from not having everybody free to vote by mail. I think it's a stupid calculation, because if you think about who's not going to vote if they can't vote by mail, it will typically be older voters. And all the polls show that older voters tend to vote much more Republican than younger voters. But that is to the extent it's being politicized, that's the breakdown. It's more red states resisting. I think there's been a lot of progress, though, in the last couple of weeks, with lots and lots of leaders of the Republican Party saying, we got to get real here. We can't tell people they have to make a choice between voting and their own personal well-being. And so I'm hopeful that this issue will go away, and that some combination of litigation and persuasion will lead all or nearly all the states to allow people to have no excuse absentee balloting by the time we get to November. Other questions? Yeah, Paul. You got to unmute yourself.
Here I go. Thanks for conducting the seminar today. It's a real pleasure and rare opportunity for our community. My question is, I had a vague recollection that at the state level, there was a process underway where states would either by statute or amending their state constitution require electors to vote in accordance with the popular vote of that state. Is that widespread in being at level to the point where it would eliminate the problem you hypothesize?
No. It is true that most states require the electors to pledge, and there are a few states that actually require them to honor their pledges. The 2 states at issue in this case are Washington and Colorado. Washington makes it a criminal offense not to vote the way you pledge to vote. And the issue in that case is it okay for Washington to criminally prosecute the elector for voting the wrong way? In Colorado, what they do is they actually replace you on the electoral slate if you vote the wrong way on the day of the voting. And so Mr. Baca, the plaintiff in that, the petitioner in that case, was not allowed to cast his electoral vote because he cast it for somebody other than Hillary Clinton. The question in the case is, though, whether states have that power. The argument that is being advanced is that the original understanding of the Electoral College by the framers, and there's some support for this in like the Federalist Papers, was that it was going to be deliberative, that it would decide who the right person is for the job, and be kind of a buffer between people, the mob, and the decision-making about the president. And so the argument is that while states can try to prevent electors from deviating and being faithless, the states are powerless to enforce that. So that's what we'll find out in June. They're going to argue this case by telephone on May 12th. This is a new adventure for the Supreme Court. They're starting for the first time in their history to do telephone oral arguments in the first 2 weeks of May. I argued a case by telephone at the beginning of, I guess it was on St. Patrick's Day, right after the lockdown. And it was very strange because you couldn't see the judges and they couldn't see you. You didn't know what kind of reaction you're getting. Interestingly though, this week, the Campaign Legal Center, where I work, is conducting, along with other lawyers, a trial in Florida using Zoom. With the witnesses and all the lawyers and the judge and the law clerks and everybody all in different boxes like this. And this is an experiment that's never been tried before, but it'll be interesting to see how it works. It is a trial down there about whether or not people who used to be criminals, felons who had lost their right to vote, had their right to vote restored by the vote of the people in 2018. There was a constitutional amendment passed in Florida to re-enfranchise all of about 1.4 million Floridians who had been denied the right to felon disenfranchisement, as it's known. But then the issue was, what about the fact that nearly all of those people owe fines and fees that they can't afford to pay? And so we are arguing that it's unconstitutional to keep people from voting who would otherwise be able to vote because of their poverty. So that's what the trial's about. It was considered sufficiently important by the federal judge down there that he said he was not going to wait. He was going to convene a trial by Zoom. I guess you probably couldn't do a criminal trial, but it's a civil trial, and it's an interesting experiment in technology. Again, a sort of sign of the times of how we're operating in this weird environment that we're now finding ourselves in. Other questions? Thoughts? Comments? No?
Paul, I have a question. That is, there's a lot of speculation at the Supreme Court composition level that if one of the, particularly the left-leaning judges, were to pass away before the election, whether confirmation would be had this coming year. My question is, given the most rapid confirmation process that could ever be achieved, this date is that the passing away of a current Supreme Court justice might be to allow Republican Senate to confirm a successor?
Well, the first thing I would say is they asked Mitch McConnell whether or not they would confirm a replacement for a justice in an election year this year if a vacancy occurred. And he, though the theory 4 years ago was that they didn't want to confirm Obama, Judge Garland in an election year. They wanted to wait and see who won the election first. So there's some inconsistency there. My own view is that they would confirm a justice as quickly as they had to. And they're in office until January 3rd. And, you know, there's nothing in the Constitution or background and so the truth could be done in 2 days if you had only 2 days to do it. I think they would do it in the lame duck session if need be that occurs after the election. The Senate and Congress can come back into session. And if they had to do it in just a few days, they would probably do that because, you know, especially if they knew that a Democratic president was coming in January and perhaps the Democratic Senate, that they would have lots of reason to try to get it done very quickly. When we're sort of can feel like the court's composition is not going to be changed this year until the very end of the year. There is also a lot of talk that maybe Justice Thomas might retire late in the year and allow him to be replaced by Trump in the lame duck session with a younger person. There's a theory that maybe he's tired of being a justice. I don't know, but the answer, I think the answer to your question is they could do it very quickly. Let's see, another question here. Many businesses believe that we will not return to normal after the pandemic and that some ways of doing business will forever be changed. Do you envision any permanent changes to our electoral process resulting from the pandemic? The answer to that, I think, is that it's very likely we will move toward a system where voting by mail is much, much more prevalent than it has been in the past. This has been on the rise already. California in recent years has moved to a system where it votes by, most of the votes are cast by mail. Oregon was sort of the prototype for this and does only voting by mail. Now Colorado, a couple of other states I think do it. That's one of the reasons why the election results in some of these Western states take so long to come in, because they vote by mailing your ballot on election day. And so they have to wait for these things to dribble in. and it can take a week to figure out who won the election. In all likelihood, if there's a close election this year, we'll be waiting a week for the counting to occur in a lot of states. And so, but I think once we've gone this far, people get used to the idea of voting by mail. I think they're going to like it, and that we will probably never go back as far all the way to the system where voting by mail was a small exception in most of the states, or where you needed to have a very strong excuse, like you're going to be on a business trip out of town or something like that. I don't see that as something that we're going to go back to altogether. You might wonder why we don't just vote online. Everything else we do, go to our bank accounts and pay our bills and 1,000 other things we just do on the web. The difficulty is that any expert would tell you you simply can't do too easy to hack. And it's impossible to build a web-based voting system that's sufficiently protected that it's safe to do it that way. You either want to have mailed-in ballots that give you a paper copy, or voting machines in the polling place that produce a paper copy, so you can recount it and you have some evidence. Electronic systems give you no assurance that you have the right outcome and that somebody hasn't just reprogrammed a computer to add 10,000 votes here and 10,000 votes there. And so I don't see us moving in that direction. Other thoughts?
Hey, Paul, yeah. So I've got a couple questions. One, it seems as though the Supreme Court is the last bastion of civility in our political process. Do you see anything that will likely upset that in the future, as it has upset almost everything else?
They do actually work very hard to be civil with each other, because they have to live together in that little courtroom and work together. And it is true, I think, that the Chief Justice in particular tries to maintain that good relationships with people. There have been times when civility within the court has broken down. The most, probably the most vivid one was Bush versus Gore 20 years ago, when they ended up deciding the presidential election effectively 5-4 after those painful 6 weeks of recounts and wrangling and fighting.
Great.
And there was a point after that, I think, where people were pretty mad at each other. But yeah, Chuck? I
say the great famous hanging Chad.
Yes, we got rid of those punch machines for that reason. Those Chads were a problem. So did you have another one, Chuck?
Yes, I do. So elections historically, from the beginning of time, at least in this country, have been full of chicanery, as we learn usually after the fact. Is believe that mail increases or decreases the amount of relation that's going to go on in an election, as it apparently does all the time.
Yeah, I think there is some possibility when you vote by mail that you can get the kind of stuff that went on in District 9 in North Carolina with absentee ballots in 2018, where people were going around collecting blank ballots from all the people and then filling them out for them and mailing them in. There is a possibility with mail-in voting of that kind of fraud. That's why they do the signature match thing, or they try to figure out other ways to verify that the real person filled out the ballot. But people in Oregon and Colorado and California would tell you that they haven't had problems like that. The system works pretty well. And so hopefully we won't see an upsurge in any kind of fraudulent activity as a result of this. It's certainly better that we move it to mail voting alternative this year. I mean, we really don't have a choice, I would say. There's a chat here. Let's see what this says. No. Yes, that was just a private message. Other than experience of states with history of mail. Another question from Hugh about the fraud concerns on voting. I think I kind of commented on that. Care to comment on presidential power cases coming to the DC circuit? Hugh, which presidential power cases are we talking about here? There you are.
I may be wrong about them going to the DC circuit, but Particularly one is the subpoena power. I think George Will had a nice column about that last weekend in the Post.
The subpoena power against the president. These cases, they're actually up in the Supreme Court right now. Because the Congress get to subpoena
okay,
things.
so they're all the way up.
Can the district attorney in Manhattan subpoena the tax returns of the president? Those kinds of things. We had a hint yesterday that they may be looking for a way to avoid deciding those cases. They asked for additional briefing on whether or not the cases present what's called a political question, which is a legal question that the court decides it just can't decide. And this was the way they got out from under deciding the gerrymandering issue that I talked so much about in the past, that some of you have heard me talk about. They decided that political gerrymandering is a political question, that means they can't fix it, they can't decide it. And so I think there's sort of tea leaves there suggesting they're going to duck those cases, not rule for the Congress, not rule against the Congress, and just say it's between you and the president to fight it out. We're not going to referee that dispute or something like that. That seems to be where they're headed. Looks like it's 10:30, Suzanne. Is this the place we should stop? I could take another question or two if people want.
Yeah, if there's any last question that somebody wants to ask, please do so while we have Mr. Smith captive. All right.
It looks like we're done.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Paul. We really appreciate this. This was scarily illuminating. And,
hope I didn't frighten everybody too much.
we'll all be sleepless with you tonight. So
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. And,
Great.
and
Thanks,
just
Paul.
go ahead.
Take care, everybody.
Wait.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Going to send out Dr. Hill's invite here in just a few minutes. So Dr.
Great.
Hugh Hill will be talking about virology in about 15 minutes. New invite going out.
Great. Thank you, Suzanne.
All right, guys.
Thank you.